What a beautiful picture, isn't it? Close fellowship, right there together. So Peter catches John's attention. And Peter just assumed that John knew who Jesus was talking about, but John didn't have a clue. So Peter catches John's attention and said, who's he talking about? And John just leans back on the bosom of Christ. And he said, Lord, who is it? Who is it? A beautiful picture there. A beautiful picture. I love the way John always identifies himself in his gospel. What does he say? The one whom Jesus loved. Did Jesus love John more than the others? No, but John just never could get over the fact that Jesus loved him, period. I mean, that's it. Jesus loves me, this I know, for the Bible tells me so. What a great truth for us to learn, isn't it? Some of us have gotten over it, some of us haven't. John never got over it. He was the beloved disciple. He just loved the fact that Jesus loved him, and he couldn't get over that truth. So that's what we see happening there in verse 23. There was reclining on Jesus' bosom one of his disciples whom Jesus loved. Verse 24, so Simon Peter gestured to him and said to him, tell us who it is of whom he is speaking. He, leaning back thus on Jesus' bosom, said to him, Lord, who is it? So we see John is on the right side. John, the beloved. But on his left side was the betrayer. Keeping this seating arrangement in mind, we come to verse 26. Then Jesus answered, that is the one, the betrayer, that is the one for whom I shall dip the morsel and I shall give it to him. Think about that. Jesus, at the head of the table, says, I'm going to dip this morsel and I'm going to get up out of my seat and I'm going to move around to the very end of the table where Judas ought to be sitting. This is where all the jerks sit, at the end of the table. I'm going to move down there and I'm going to feed him some. That's not what Jesus said, did it? So when he had dipped the morsel, he took it and he gave it to Judas. Can you see that? Where was Judas? Seated on his left. Seated on his left. John MacArthur says, incidentally, the one who sat on the left was the number one guest. And Judas had that seat. So Jesus feeds him first, indicating that he was the guest of honor, also indicating that he was the betrayer. Again, remember, this is a conversation between Peter and John and Jesus. The other disciples didn't have a clue what was going on. They didn't know. They thought Jesus was honoring Judas one last time by placing him in the seat of honor and feeding him as the first and foremost guest, feeding him first. We can see from the other verses that they didn't know what was going on. We see that in verse 29 and verse 28. Here's the picture. We have the picture of two men who are very close to Jesus physically. One is the beloved and the other is the betrayer. See, the potential for sin has nothing to do with our outward appearance. The potential for sin has nothing to do with our physical location. The potential for sin is all in the heart. In the heart. Because here's a great example of Satan being able to work in the heart of one who was so close to the Lord. Beloved on one side, a betrayer on the other side. You know, Jesus told us a parable that warned us about this truth. The parable of the wheat and the tares, you remember? The man who planted his field of wheat, and in the night the thieves went in and planted tares among the wheat. And then as they began to grow, they grew. Jesus said they grew together. And they said, let's go in and tear out the bad folks. Let's tear out the tares. And Jesus said, no, just let them grow together. Let them stay together. And then on the judgment day, the final day, they will be separated. Here's a picture of the beloved on one side, the betrayer on the other side. One leaning against the bosom of Christ, the other Christ just reaching over and feeding him as guests of honor. As we come to the Lord's table this morning, we need to examine our hearts also in light of the potential for sin in our lives. The potential for sin in our lives. Some of us may have started, maybe take 1 or 2 steps down a long, slippery slope that leads toward destruction. There's potential in our life right now. We've started thinking a little differently than we've thought before. We've started doing some things differently than we've done before. And the potential, Paul said this, therefore he who thinks he stands, take heed, what? Lest he falls. That's the potential for sin. I have a friend who's a recovering alcoholic. He's been sober for over 30 years. But Joe continues to say, I'm just 1 drink away from being a drunk. That should be the Christian's attitude towards sin, the potential for sin in our life. We're just 1 mistake away from blowing it all. John on one side, Judas on the other. They were close in their location, but they were distant in their heart. As I said, the heart is deceitful, is more deceitful than all else, and is desperately wicked. Who can understand it? We need to realize that sin can lurk at our door